From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Phantom Policeman. When I first lived in London, I stayed for a short time in a small hotel near Waterloo Station. It was cheap, unpretentious, and tolerably clean. The people who patronized it were mostly new arrivals in London, like myself. I chatted with one of them. His name was Evans. He was an elderly man who told me about a ghostly experience he once had in Thameside. It happened when he was staying with friends near Raynham. At that time, the Thameside, especially in the vicinity of Raynham and Dagenham, bore a very sinister reputation owing to the number of bad characters that frequented it. One evening Evans went for a stroll alone. Having been warned about the neighborhood, he armed himself with a pistol and thick stick. He did not intend to go far, but the weather was so fine, and he felt so well and energetic, that he passed through Dagenham and continued walking in a westerly direction. On either side of him were ditches full of stagnant water, covered with duckweed, and beyond them wide tracts of desolate marshy ground. There was a feeling of loneliness and depression in the atmosphere, which intensified the further he progressed. He was contemplating turning back when he sensed someone behind him. He glanced hastily round and saw coming along the road, with the measured stride characteristic of his vocation, a tall policeman who appeared to be very young. He overtook Evans and passed by him without a word or look. Evans again deliberated turning back, but a force over which he had no control compelled him to follow the policeman, who kept moving ahead with the same measured, automatic stride. He never altered his pace nor made a sound, and there was an indistinctness and shadowiness about him that Evans noticed now for the first time. He continued advancing till he reached the Four Wants, crossroads leading to Ilford, Hornchurch, and Chigwell, when he was swallowed up in the gloom and shadows that enveloped the spot. Evans realized now that it was no living policeman whom he had been following, but a ghost, and this realization, combined with the loneliness of the surroundings and a feeling of sudden and intense eeriness, unnerved him to such an extent that he turned and made hurriedly for home. When he related his experience to his friends, they exhibited considerable interest, and said he must have seen the ghost of a young policeman named Clark, who had been horribly murdered near the Four Wants some years previously. The apparition of poor Clark had for a long time been rumoured to haunt the vicinity of Dagenham and the Four Wants, which bore such an uncanny reputation on that account, that few persons cared to venture near them after dusk. An Epping Forest Mystery. When my wife and I were living in the High Street, Kensington, among our acquaintances was Mrs. Dean, a widow, whom we had met recently at a club in Chelsea. She came to tea with us one cold, windy day in March, and told us the following strange experience she once had in Epping Forest. In my childhood, she said, I lived at Chingford. There were 4 of us in the family, namely my father, who was a barrister, my mother Delphine, and myself. Delphine was my twin sister. She was a lovely blonde. We were inseparable, and one of our favorite haunts was in the vicinity of High Beech Hill, known afterwards as Queen Victoria's Woods. The scenery there reminded us of the fairyland in our storybook. We loved to ramble along the old beech trees and sit under them on hot summer days, chatting and eating fruit. One of the trees had a very strong attraction for us. We called it the Nymph's Pool, and imagined that a nymph sat in a tree overhanging it and sang and combed her beautiful golden hair. We both went to school and left the same term. Delphine, after she had been to the Slade School in London, went to Paris, where she shared a studio in the Montparnasse with another girl. I trained for the stage at a dramatic academy in Oxford Street. When we were 21 years of age, we both became engaged to be married, Delphine to a Frenchman and I to a journalist. My parents and I tried our hardest to persuade Delphine to break off her engagement. My parents did not approve of Delphine marrying a Frenchman about whom she knew very little. I had met him and did not like him. He struck me as untrustworthy, and I learned his reputation was none too good. Our efforts to prevent Delphine marrying him failed. They were married in Paris, spent their honeymoon in Algiers, and lived in Marseille, where he had a house. Shortly after Delphine's marriage, I too married and left a dramatic academy. My husband and I lived at Lawton, but he was not strong and died before we had been married a year. Though I was left comfortably off, I hated being idle and continued training for the stage. After I had finished at the academy, I went on tour for a short time and then got a small part in a West End production. For about a year after her marriage, I heard fairly often from Delphine. She seemed happy and spoke in glowing terms of her husband, how kind and generous he was to her, and what a gay life they led, with lots of friends and amusements. Gradually, however, her letters came less frequently, and reading between the lines in some of them, I got the impression that she was worried and not very happy. I was rehearsing a play that was opening at the Duchess Theatre in a fortnight when I received a brief letter from Delphine saying she and her husband were going to South America. She said she would send me their address when they got there. Weeks and months passed, however, without a line from her. I wrote to her Marseille address with urgent and kindly forward on the envelope, but I had no reply. My mother and I, my father was dead, were terribly worried about Delphine, but there was nothing we could do. Another year passed, and then one day I received, to my joy and relief, a cablegram from Delphine, saying she was returning to England that very day in the Zephyr, and would wire to me on her arrival at Liverpool. I found out at the office of the firm that owned the Zephyr the day that ship would reach Liverpool. The day before it was due, I was sitting in the drawing-room at my old home at Chingford, when I suddenly experienced a sensation of intense coldness. I glanced at the door to see if it was open, but it was shut. The window was open at the top, as the weather was very close. A longing came over me to see the nymph's pool that had such a peculiar attraction for Delphine and me when we were children, and I set off at once to High Beech Hill. The tree was on the east side of the hill. The winding road to it was rather rough and broken in parts, and as I hurried along it, I kept thinking about Delphine, wishing it was the next day, when I should hear from her, and wondering if I should see any change in her. When I came within sight of the nymph's pool, I saw someone standing by it. It was a woman in dark clothes, and on drawing nearer to her, I saw to my utter astonishment that it was Delphine. I was distressed to see she was very pale and did not look at all well, so thin and wan, not a bit like her old self. "Delphine," I cried joyfully, "what a gorgeous surprise! What bliss to see you again!" She smiled and held out her arms, and I was running to embrace her when she vanished. There was no Delphine, only the nymph tree. Greatly shocked and fearing that something dreadful had happened to Delphine, I hastened home. The following morning I received a telegram saying Delphine had died suddenly the previous evening. The doctor who examined her body was of the opinion that death was due to heart disease. She had died at about the time I had seen her apparition. In the diary which I found in her trunk, she said she had a terrible time. Her husband had behaved so abominably to her that she had left him. If only she had taken my advice and never married him, Mrs. Dean sighed. She might have been alive now. The Ghost of the Grinning Woman. My family had associations with Worcestershire. My father had a living in that county. My youngest sister was born there, and my eldest sister was educated first at Powys, then at Malvern. When I was a boy, my mother employed a Miss Millward to do needlework for her. She was the daughter of a Worcestershire farmer and had 2 sisters. All 3 were dressmakers, and might have done extremely well, for they were clever, had they not talked rather more than they worked. The eldest sister, the one who worked for my mother, He used to tell me ghost stories, which harrowed me to such an extent that I was terrified when alone in the dark. One of the stories was about a haunting of the Severn by the phantom of an old woman named Polly Rigden. Polly was a very disreputable character. She sold matches, begged, told fortunes, and was occasionally imprisoned for stealing. She was said to have been pretty in her youth, but there was little to indicate it in her old age. She was chiefly to be seen in the street near the Hop Market. Screams were heard one night in the vicinity of the Severn, and in the morning her body was found in the river. There were no marks of violence on it. How she got in the Severn was not known, and the verdict at the inquest was found drowned. One summer evening, soon after the finding of her body, the eldest Miss Millward and her youngest sister were returning home from work by the Severn when they saw an old woman squatting on the bank of the river. She had grey, dishevelled hair and a very wrinkled face. Her dress was much soiled, and her elastic-sided boots very down at the heels. She looked like a tramp. There was something so peculiar about her that the Millwards were puzzled and stopped and stared at her. She observed them looking at her, grinned, revealing toothless gums, waved a filthy hand, and vanished. They were looking at her one moment, and the next second into empty space. They were not so much scared as mystified, and wondered if they had been dreaming. They had never seen Polly Rigden or heard of her death, but they learned some days after their strange experience that a ghost, believed to be that of Polly, had appeared to several people in the very place where they had seen the strange old woman. The haunting, like so many hauntings, was only temporary. It continued nightly for 2 or 3 weeks, and then ceased. A Sinister Severn Haunting. The following is one of several stories related to me at various times about the Severn and its ghosts. John Evans was sitting one morning in his room in an hotel in Chicago when he suddenly noticed something on the floor close to his chair. It was a photograph of his sister Mabel. He wondered how it had got on the floor because he always kept it in an album, but thought that it might possibly have become detached and fallen out of the album. But when? His album was in one of the drawers of the bureau, and he did not remember moving it, certainly not very recently. He gazed lovingly at the photograph. He had not seen her for 12 years. She had been only 17 when he last saw her. It was the night he left home for Liverpool. The photograph brought it all back to him. The dear old farmhouse in Worcestershire, nestling among the trees, the lane, with the hedgerows full of wild flowers leading to it, the stone-flagged hall with the old-fashioned fireplace and chimney corners, the hams hanging from the beams, the grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner, his mother trying to keep back her tears, his red-faced, grey-haired father slipping an envelope with money in his hand, telling him in a husky voice to be sure to let them know directly he got to America. Lucy, his eldest sister, just back from riding, handsome in her dark, hard style, and very much the outdoor girl, endeavouring not at all successfully to appear sorry he was going, and Mabel, sad-eyed, smiling forcedly through her tears. A pretty family picture, marred only, he thought, by Lucy. They never had got on well together. What change 12 years had brought about? His mother and father were both dead. Lucy was married and living in New Zealand, and Mabel married to William Leake, an architect. The Leakes had no children. He had always been very fond of Mabel. She was so kind and gentle and sympathetic, such a good, thoughtful girl, not giddy like so many others. He had not heard from her for a long time, but then it was his fault he had not written to her. Somehow he had been so absorbed in his work that he had never had time for such correspondence. Still, it was very wrong of him not to have written to her. During the years he had been in America, he had been very successful and had accumulated quite a lot of money. He had taken few holidays and always been very thrifty. He was very abstemious, did not smoke, drink anything alcoholic, or gamble. He had few friends. Friends meant spending money. And he had to save for his old age. He had not married. He would leave his money to Mabel. He kept thinking about her and gazing yearningly at her photograph. She was extremely attractive, a natural blonde with golden hair, light blue eyes, and a lovely mouth. She was so pure and innocent that he vowed he would kill anyone who ever injured her. That night he dreamed that someone, whom he instinctively felt was Mabel, came to his bedside and kissed him gently on the forehead. The dream increased his longing to see Mabel to such an extent that he decided to take a holiday and go to England. He booked a passage in a liner from New York to Liverpool, and on arriving in England set out to the last address he had of Mabel. It was in a small town between Worcester and Tewkesbury. When he arrived at the town he asked the way to the Laurels, the Leakes' house, and was told it was about a mile from the town and close to the Severn. He was walking by that river in the direction indicated to him when he saw a tall, thin man standing near a tree on the town side of the river. The man was rather elderly, pale, and haggard. He walked ahead of Evans and entered a red brick house facing the river and about 100 yards from it. When Evans reached the house, he found it was the Laurels, but to his astonishment, there was a board on the railings of the small garden in front of it saying it was for sale. It appeared to be empty. He knocked and rang several times, but no one came to the door. He wondered what had become of the man he had seen into the house, and why, if he was still in it, he did not appear. Much puzzled and bitterly disappointed, he inquired for the Leakes at a small house a little distance from the Laurels. The lady who lived there asked if he was a stranger in the neighborhood, and when he answered in the affirmative, without disclosing his identity, she told him that the Laurels had stood empty ever since the tragic death of Mr. William Leake. He had drowned himself in the river on learning that his wife had left him and gone away with a traveler for a large firm of London jewelers. Evans asked the lady if she knew Mrs. Leake's maiden name. The lady told him that she heard it was Evans. She said William Leake was his wife's third husband. She had been Mrs. Green, a widow, before Mr. Leake married her. The lady of the house was not sure of the name of Mrs. Leake's first husband, but thought it was Welkin or Felkin. She was very attractive, always expensively dressed, and from all accounts was a dreadful flirt. She said everyone had felt sorry for Mr. Leake. She had never met either him or his wife, as she had only been in the district a few months. Evans thanked her and went. He was terribly upset. To think of Mabel, who had been such a good girl, behaving like that. He remembered having seen a white house very near the river shortly before he saw the man who had entered the Laurels. The people living in the house might have known Mabel. It was just possible that what the woman had just said about her might not have been correct. She had not been acquainted with Mabel, and all she knew about her had been derived from local gossip. He returned to the Laurels and knocked on the door again, and rang the bell. There was still no response, no sign of any life, and the silent, empty house gave him such an eerie feeling that he quickly left it. He experienced a similar sensation, and in a greater degree, when he was passing the spot by the river where he had first seen the mysterious, tall, thin man. When he inquired about the Leakes at the White House, the lady there told him that it was nearly 4 years since they had left the neighborhood. The last occupants of the Laurels had been the Leakes. Evans asked her if she was sure about it, and she said of course she was sure. She knew both the families. Mabel Leake was one of her dearest friends. Evans asked if it was true Mabel had been married 3 times. The lady laughed and said it certainly was not true. Mabel had only had one husband, Bill, whom she adored. They were devoted to one another. Overjoyed at hearing this, Evans told the lady he was Mabel's brother, and also what the woman in the other house had said about Mabel. Mrs. Hay, the lady of the White House, said the person he mentioned had only recently come to the district and had probably never heard of the Leakes. When he inquired about them, she must have thought that he meant the Leeds. Mrs. Leeds had been married 3 times, and had not been very fortunate in her marriages. Her first husband was an epileptic. She had to divorce her second husband, who ill-used her, and Herbert Leeds was very queer at times. His grandfather and one of his uncles had committed suicide, but Mrs. Leeds had been unaware of this when she married him. Mrs. Hay said some of the local people thought it very wrong of Mrs. Leeds to leave her husband and go off with another man, but there was some excuse for her conduct. Mr. Leeds was absurdly jealous, even if his wife as much as looked at another man, and had been heard to threaten to kill her and himself. Evans asked Mrs. Hay to describe Herbert Leeds. and her description of him tallied with a tall, thin apparition Evans had seen enter the Laurels. He told Mrs. Hay about the ghost, and she said several people she knew had seen it too, and that it was known to haunt the Laurels and the river. She said that the river, however, was well known to be haunted long before Leeds drowned himself in it, and she wondered if the haunting might not have affected him. She had often felt there was something very sinister about the spot where he had committed suicide. Evans chatted with her for some time, and she gave him Mabel's address. It was in Hove. Immensely relieved at what she had told him, he thanked her very much, and without letting Mabel know, he set off at once to Hove. The Leeks were at home when he arrived at their house, and were delighted to see him. He thought Mabel was even more attractive than when he last saw her, and when he looked at her and her husband, he felt assured that what Mrs. Hay had said about them was true, and that they really were a very happy and devoted couple. The Haunting of Dipdale Hole. From time to time there are strange stories of ghostly happenings at Dipdale Hole in the Midlands, and this is one of them. In the days before the advent of motor cars and aeroplanes, there were living at Crampton, a small country town within about 60 miles of Worcester, Mr. and Mrs. Marlene, and their young, extremely attractive daughter Peggy. As was only natural, she had many admirers. Among them were two young men, Carlo Havadar, a South American, who was reputed to be very rich, and Charlie Carter, the son of a local clergyman. There was much speculation in Crampton as to which of these two young men Peggy liked best. To celebrate her 21st birthday, her parents gave a ball, and purposely omitted to invite Carter. This omission gave great offense to Peggy, who informed her parents that she hated Havadar and was very fond of Carter. Her father promptly forbade Carter to come to the house to communicate in any way with Peggy. Carter was a bank clerk, and Mr. Marlene was very desirous that his charming daughter should marry someone wealthy. Carter, who was well liked in Crampton, received much sympathy. The night of the dance arrived, and to the astonishment of all the guests, among the first to enter the ballroom was Carter. He had got into the house unobserved. Mr. Marlene wanted to have him turned out at once, but on Peggy saying that if he did, she would at once retire to her room and not show her face again till the morning, he sulkily gave in, and Charlie was allowed to remain. Then came surprise number 2. Peggy, looking more beautiful than ever in a new dress, was standing in the center of a host of admiring men of all ages, and Havadar and Charlie Carter, who had been regarding one another with anything but amiable looks, were getting ready to approach her and petition for dances, when a new arrival suddenly appeared on the scene. He was a slim, very boyish-looking young man, clean-shaven, of medium height, and immaculately dressed. His features were almost too regular and effeminate for a male, and he had very beautiful hands. There was something oddly arrestive about him, and he at once became the Sinister of all eyes. Going up to Peggy, as if he had known her all his life, he bowed and asked for the first dance, which, to the indignation of all around, she smilingly gave him. What followed took away everyone's breath. The two danced together most of the evening. Mr. and Mrs. Marlene stormed, and Havadar pleaded, but it was of no avail. Peggy was to all appearances tremendously infatuated. She had eyes and ears for no one but her clean-shaven, boyish-looking partner, whom she called Terry. In the supper interval there was a scene. Havadar made an insulting remark about Terry, who heard him and threw the contents of a wine-glass in his face. A fight would undoubtedly have ensued had not several of the guests interfered. Nothing further happened that night, and when the hour for departure came, the guests left the house quietly and seemingly on very good terms with one another. After the ball, Peggy and Terry were constantly seen together, and it was rumored that they were engaged to be married. Mr. Marlene and Carlo Havadar were greatly distressed by her conduct, but to people's surprise, neither Mrs. Marlene nor Carter seemed to trouble. After this state of affairs had gone on for several weeks, Terry suddenly left Crampton and was said to have gone to Buenos Aires to find out all he could about Havadar, who was supposed to be a native of that town. About 3 months after Terry's departure for South America, Peggy Marlene called on her bosom friend Effie Miller, and joyfully informed her that Terry had returned to England and would arrive at Crampton the following day. She announced her intention of going to the station in the evening to meet him. On her way home, however, she met with an accident and had to remain indoors all the next day. That same day, Effie Miller visited her aged aunt, Miss Emma Brown, who lived in a village about 4 miles from Crampton. It was getting dusk when she set out on her homeward journey, and the road she took was lonely and little frequented. It led past Dipdale Hole, a deep, dark, circular pit, at the bottom of which was a pool covered with green slime, and believed by the local people to be unfathomable. When she came to the hole, she paused and shuddered. It always had that effect on her. There was something frightening about the trees that surrounded it. They did not seem to her to be ordinary trees, but trees that were watching her with hidden, baleful eyes. The air had suddenly grown so chilly that she quickly left the hole and continued on her way. She had reached Corpse Copse, so named because the dead body of a tramp had been found in it, when she heard the sound of approaching wheels, and in a moment or two a gig appeared. The moon was now visible, and the light from it enabled her to see very clearly the 2 occupants of the gig. Hervidar was driving, and to her astonishment, seated next to him was his supposed rival, Terry, who took off his hat to her and smiled. She heard the gig for a short time after it had passed her, and it seemed to stop suddenly. A moment later she heard a cry so full of terror that her blood froze. She tried to persuade herself that it was a night bird, and quickened her steps, never pausing till she had reached Crampton. In the morning she called at the Mellerines, and told Peggy that she had seen Terry driving along the Dipdale Hole road with Hervidar. "I did not know they were friends," she said. "They are not!" Peggy exclaimed. "Are you sure it was Terry?" Effie nodded. "Quite sure. He took off his hat to me and smiled." "If that is the case," Peggy said, "I shall see him very soon. He may be here any moment." But the morning and the afternoon and the evening passed, and no Terry came. In spite of her intense dislike of Hervidar, Peggy sent for him. "I hear you drove Mr. Terry along the Dipdale Road yesterday," she said. "Where is he?" Hervidar shook his head. "You have been misinformed," he replied. "I did give a lift to a man last night, but he was a stranger. I never saw him before, and have not seen him since. I put him down at the road to Mayhem." Peggy made inquiries to Mirby, the nearest railway station to Crampton, and a porter told her that a young man answering to her description of Terry had got out there early the previous evening, and had set out on foot along the Crampton road. Some minutes later he had seen Hervidar take the same road in his gig. The moon was full at the time, and the light from it being powerful, he could see Hervidar's face very plainly. This was all Peggy could learn at Mirby Station. Bill Watts, a boy whom the Mellerines employed occasionally to help in the garden, had something to tell her. He lived at Mirby, where Hervidar also lived. He said he was returning home from work at about 7 o'clock in the evening, that Effie Miller had declared she had seen Terry with Hervidar, and he was near Dipdale Hole when he heard a cry. It was like a woman, he thought, in a great fright. It gave him a start. A minute or two later Hervidar passed him in a gig. He was alone, and going in the direction of Mirby. Soon after, Bill Watts' tale stories of ghostly happenings at Dipdale Hole were current. Gruesome lights were said to be seen around the hole, and ghastly cries heard in its depth. Few people dared to venture near it alone after nightfall. The haunting, like most hauntings, was intermittent. There were periods when nothing ghostly occurred, and it was during one of these intervals that a man, who had been lowered into the hole to rescue a dog that had fallen into it, found a skeleton. The height and build of the skeleton corresponded very closely to those of Terry, and Crampton people, remembering the stories that were in circulation at the time of Terry's disappearance, were of the opinion that the skeleton was his. Great was their astonishment when the medical man who examined the skeleton pronounced it to be that of a woman. There were no marks of violence on it. People who recollected Terry's effeminate appearance and ways inclined to the belief that Terry might well have been a woman. They could get nothing out of Peggy, who had married Charlie Carter. Whenever they questioned her, she invariably gave a non-committal answer and turned the subject. They thought it not unlikely that she and her husband had known Terry was a woman all along, and had employed her as a means of getting rid of Hervidar. Did Hervidar, they wondered, believing Terry to be a man and his rival, Murdered Terry the night Effie stated he saw Hervidar and Terry driving along Dipdale Hole Road in a gig. Hervidar left Murby soon after Terry's disappearance and was believed to have returned to South America. The fate of Terry and the identity of the skeleton in Dipdale Hole were, however, mysteries that were never really solved, and the haunting of the hole and trees around it has continued intermittently to this day.